Good evening and welcome to this evening's event. To begin our program, please welcome the Director of External Affairs of the Boston Debate League, Jackney Joseph.
Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you all here tonight for the first in our Race Equity Policy Series forums. Tonight's topic is exploring criminal justice reform. The Boston Debate League's mission is to integrate argumentation and competitive debate into Boston, Chelsea, and Somerville public schools, to develop critical thinkers ready for college, career, and engagement in the world around them. Our partner this evening is Suffolk University, and their mission is to provide students with experiential and transformational learning opportunities. And so we are excited to partner in this effort to bring this year-long series of dialogues and learning to students and the broader community. Through a series of 5 virtual community forums and a half-day virtual conference, we will explore the multiple facets of criminal justice reform, from policing to sentencing to criminal justice and the immigrant experience. We'll be connecting the BDL, Suffolk, and Boston communities to policymakers, change makers, and people who have had impact in the criminal justice system. And we are excited to be joined by the star panel this evening. And before we do that, I'd love to just make sure that those who are participating know that there are Spanish language translation, interpretation services, and you can find those at the bottom of the Zoom window there if you need Spanish language translation. And ask that everybody keep their mics muted. And I know we are joined tonight by Boston Debate League students, our debaters, as well as Suffolk University students. So students, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and let us know if you are a BDL student or a Suffolk student. We want to make sure that our students' questions get asked. So I'm not going to do an extensive introduction, but I know that our panelists are excited to join us tonight, and we'll be speaking to a little bit of their experiences and their expertise. So a quick introduction, Boston City Councilor Andrea Campbell, who I believe will be joining us shortly, Massachusetts State Representative Russell Holmes. There we are, joined by Boston City Councilor Andrea Campbell, State Representative Russell Holmes, Attorney Joseph Feaster, who is a member of the Boston Police Task Force, as well as the chair of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, and Brenda Bond-Fortier, Professor of Administration at the Institute for Public Service at Suffolk University. So as we get started tonight, I just want to remind everyone of a few names as we start off this conversation. Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Those lives were lost, and it really sparked protests, anguish, and a level of awareness about police brutality and misconduct in our country, and particularly in the Black community. But this issue is not new, but we're now seeing renewed calls for accountability, truly reforming policing to serve the community. But how do we address the root causes of this, and what does this reform look like? I'm looking forward to this conversation with our panelists, and I want to start at the state level with Representative Russell Holmes. Can you talk a little bit about your work to establish a special commission on structural racism and criminal justice reform, and how you see that work impacting legislative efforts around police reform?
Well, thank you so much, Jackney, for having me, and thank the esteemed panel for joining me. It's an honor to be on a panel with all three, and I hope to have a very robust conversation tonight. And especially thank you to the BPL and all the students, and of course, Suffolk University. So I'm Russell Holmes. I have the honor of representing the neighborhoods of Mattapan, Dorchester, Hyde Park, Rosendale, and JP. It is a district that is 92% of color. 70% of the district that I represent is Black, and about 22% of it is Latino and Asian. And so I heard the names, of course, that Jackney mentioned, and there's a name that for me comes even before those, and that is, of course, Trayvon Martin. He happened in about 2012. And so I entered the legislature in 2010, and the start of what happens around police and community was already one of the conversations. But in the Black and Latino caucus, what we did is we did essentially a movement on the House floor where we went in and after after Trayvon Martin's unfortunate incident in Florida, we went in, some of us with our hoodies on, and just said, look, this is something that's totally unacceptable. And so I still find when we have these conversations, it is important for us to all still remember that sometimes, or most times, we're having these conversations in isolation. And I still see that where when I walked on the floor that day, people, my colleagues, which I thought would be very familiar with what's happening, were still looking at us strange. Like at the time, I think there may have been maybe 7 or 8 members of the caucus. We've grown substantially since then. We're almost double that. But at the time, it was a surprise. Like, what does this mean? Explain this to us, because we're still so siloed in some of these conversations. And I know that to be the fact still to this day, because I think of the new representative-elect from Missouri. I think her name is, I think it's Bush, but Cori Bush. She was recently wearing the mask, the face mask that had Breonna Taylor's name on it, and actually had some of her colleagues come up and call her Breonna Taylor or Breonna, because that's what they thought her name actually was. And it's just something that when we enter these conversations, we have to enter it not believing or not knowing, or knowing that many folks do not understand all of the context. And so many times we have to give them a broader conversation. And so certainly since the incident in 2012, myself and actually a Republican, Representative Vieira, we've been following a bill that was, as Jackie mentioned, which was a commission to go figure out what should we do about police standards here in the Commonwealth. We are only one of 4 states that do not have this already in the country. And we initially started this to say, hey, let's set up a commission because it's so controversial. Let's just set up a commission to figure out what we should do for police officer standards and training. And what that is essentially, as you think about it, is if you think about what happens in almost every career, Joe's is an attorney. He obviously has a license to practice at the bar, and he has to have a license, or he has to pass the bar at different levels. If he want to practice in Massachusetts, if he want to practice at the U.S. Supreme Court or SJC, he has to have all of these requirements. I am a financial planner as well as a state representative, so I have to have a license to be able to do financial planning, whether it be in Massachusetts or across the country. However, that is not the case for police. And you can see one of the worst incidents of that is when we see the incident with Tamir Rice, where you had a very bad police officer or someone who is known to be not performing well, show up in a park and within seconds shoot someone. And it was known before this incident happened that he could have these tendencies, but he was able to move from one police department to another. And so the bulk of the bill, or the purpose of the bill, is to have it so that police officers would also have a license. So you will not be able to move from one police department within the Commonwealth to another without having this license that says you have met the requirements of training, and you have also not done a list of things that would have you have your license taken. And that was the primary. I don't want to be too long, but we recently have passed legislation in the House and Senate, and that's police officers or peace officer standard training was one major component of it that we thought needed to be passed and was done in the House and Senate. Another component of, there are 4 of them, was around use of force, on what do we do about chokeholds, no-knock warrants, and the like. Another component of it was civil service, which is, for those who don't know, there's an exam you take to get on your police, fire, and EMS. across this Commonwealth. And that is swayed very heavily towards veterans, and it leans very heavily towards having a police departments that are essentially all white. State police is 95% male, 90% white. And then there was a last component of it that that has it so that we wanted to take some language that the inmates at MCI Norfolk have been working with the Black and Latino caucus on around structural racism. And those were the four main components of the bill. And it's been stuck in committee, quite frankly, because there's been a major movement around qualified immunity. And I'm sure many of your debate team and Suffolk University staff, students would have known what qualified immunity is at this point. And I'll end there and just say, we're hoping to get it done before January.
And Rep. Holmes, can you please just talk a little bit about qualified immunity for those who don't understand that issue? Yes.
Sure. So essentially, and I'm sure Attorney Fiesel may get into this in greater detail, but qualified immunity is a provision that essentially has been going on now for I think 40 or 50 years, where it's something established in law that you now, when it's time to go and sue, and particularly in this case, but what has become a police conversation, but it has been broadened to whether or not you can sue other members of government. But around police, can you sue them civilly? Like if I have an incident, all the cases you mentioned, Mr. Floyd, can the family, after everything has been litigated, can they also come back now and sue them civilly? And there's a provision that the Supreme Court has said in the past, you must be able to show the exact same thing happening in the past for this to be something that can move forward. And it's called qualified immunity. It's the provision that's been put out there. And so the police unions in particular, have been very active in the Massachusetts legislature around qualified immunity because of the fact they've literally, which was not a part of the things we were negotiating as part of the four components, but they came back and said, well, that is for everyone from Ayanna Presley to Councilor Campbell, myself, and others thought we should do something around qualified immunity to make it so that families can be able to sue. What they would sue now is they would sue the city or the municipality, and that's who would pay this fee, whatever was awarded to the family. However, what has been a very good way of advertising or coming against this issue is you literally have police departments and their wives calling the state house, calling legislators and saying, wait a minute, we're going to allow families to be able to sue if something goes wrong. They're going to come and take my house, come and take the things that I own. And so there were 66 members, quite frankly, in the House, which was a surprise to, I think, many of us, that voted against even the things that we talked about, the four provisions, but we also put some language in around qualified immunity. And that's what I mean. That is the thing that, quite frankly, is the loggerhead for what we're trying to figure out what we should do at the State House. I hope that was enough explanation.
Thank you. I'd like to move to the city level and talk to Councilor Campbell. In your first term, you expanded the council's Committee on Public Safety to include criminal justice in an effort to bring important conversations around reentry services, returning citizens, solitary confinement, and the school to prison pipeline to the council. Can you talk about your efforts to increase accountability, transparency, and justice in policing in Boston, and how that work can be done collectively alongside organizations and community leaders?
Thank you, Jackney, and thank you, of course, to BDL and your team, your leadership, your staff, as well as Suffolk University for the partnership and for having me. And of course, thank you to all of my colleagues who, and I say colleagues, so we work in partnership, who are on this panel. It's an honor to be on here with each and every one of you. I will say a few things. I mean, you could answer that question in so many different ways and take up the whole hour, but I don't have that. So I will say that when I first got to the council, the committee was just the Committee on Public Safety, and it dealt with traditional issues that you would think about. The budget for the police department, the budget for EMS, which is our ambulatory services, and then of course the budget for the fire department. And when I decided to expand the committee, it was based on a few different things. One was the district I serve, which is predominantly a district of color, and a community that is incarcerated at very high levels. So the city of Boston is also where a large number of residents who are returning from our prisons, our Department of Correction, and of course the House of Correction come back to. So we have a lot of residents who are not originally from Boston who come here for services, major topic of discussion. And I also brought the lens from a personal story. The reason I became elected in the first place was after losing my twin brother named Andre, who we both obviously grew up in the city of Boston. We were Boston public school kids. I leave Boston Latin School and go off to Princeton University and then UCLA for law school and come back and start my legal career representing students in education cases. My twin brother, on the other hand, cycles in and out of the criminal justice system and passes away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees our prisons here in Massachusetts, when he was only 29. And he was a pretrial detainee. I always stress that point. He hadn't gone to trial for anything, but he had a high cash bail and was held in custody for 2 years. He had a disease called scleroderma, which is an autoimmune disease, no cure, had been doing really well until he got arrested. And while in the custody of the DOC, as a result of receiving inadequate health care, passed away while in that system when he was only 29. And so all of this for me I thought it was incredibly important that this Committee on Public Safety and the council and the city government expand to include these very real issues that are affecting not only communities of color and low-income residents, but every resident in the city of Boston. So for me, it was talking about what's the role the city can play in ensuring those who are formerly incarcerated have access to reentry services. What's the role the city of Boston can play in talking about how we over-incarcerate, and that those who are behind bars are predominantly Black and Brown, and talking about the conditions of confinement. So we did a lot of conversations around solitary confinement, for example. If you're incarcerated, you spend 23 hours in lockdown, and then you're expected to come out into our society with no mental health supports, for example, and be a productive citizen. So really opened up the space to talk about these issues as well. But I also thought it was critically important that this committee have authority to talk about these issues, but not just talk about them. And this sort of connects to what Representative Holmes was saying, to not talk about the issues in a siloed way. Those who are incarcerated or in our criminal justice system, all of that also connects to the policing reform conversation we're having, to our cradle to prison pipeline, or cradle to prison or school to prison. There's just different terminology out there, pipeline. I'm a former education attorney. I know that many of our young kids got into the system, the policing system, the criminal justice system, because of school-based offenses. My youngest client was 6 when I was an education attorney. My oldest client was 22. Whole range of clients and a large list of disciplinary cases where we saw this to be true. So this committee was an opportunity to talk about these issues in a non-siloed way. And then of course, to think about collective solutions to respond. I think one of the things that is missing and a little bit disappointing in the conversation around policing reform, particularly in the media space, is that we are not talking about the cradle to prison pipeline. We are not talking about those men and women who are incarcerated within our prisons and our houses of correction at alarming rates as well. And so we need to pay attention to all of these issues and not work on them in silos. In terms of the committee's work with respect to all of these issues, we have pushed for a long time, transparency, so data with respect to all of these issues. And releasing that automatically, not through public records requests. It is a fight for us to get data. I recently had to subpoena our own police department to look at our stop and frisk or FIO data that demonstrated that certain communities, which we all know to be true, are over-policed. And in many respects that that Black residents in particular are over-policed. Last year's data demonstrated that over 70% of our police stops last year were Black residents, even though we only make up a quarter of the population. And this has actually gotten worse over time. So we need to be more transparent with respect to our data and what is happening to our children in terms of arrest rates, disciplinary rates, expulsion rates, suspension rates in our schools, what is happening in our police departments, and what is, of course, happening in our prisons. And then, of course, accountability. When something goes terribly wrong, how do we hold people accountable? And so we've done a lot of work there, including the Civilian Review Board, which is a major topic of discussion right now. This has been a topic of discussion even long before I got to the council, and we'll continue to push for it. So I don't want to take up the entire time. So there's a lot of issues we're currently working on to ensure that all of these systems are transparent, and many of them are policing department diverse. We need more men and people of color serving in these departments, and that if something goes terribly wrong, we have apparatuses and mechanisms in place to hold people accountable. And I think that's critically important. For me, it's personal. I talk about my twin brother all the time. My family still does not know under what circumstances he died. And it's a struggle to still find that out. And so if that's true for me, and I'm in the system and I'm well educated and I have relationships, you can only imagine what it's like for brown and black families who have no relationships, who don't speak English as a first language, who are not attorneys, who may not be aware of their rights. So there's still tremendous work to do. And it shouldn't take a George Floyd or other deaths and public murders for us to begin to be bold and courageous with respect to these reforms. So really happy to be here and to answer more questions from all of you.
Thank you so much. Before I go on to our next panelist, I just want to encourage our students. I know we have some BDL and Suffolk students participating, and please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and just indicate that you are a student, so you make sure that your questions get asked. I'd like to move on now to Attorney Joseph Feaster. You've been a long time active resident in Boston community. You've served in many advisory capacities for many organizations addressing community concerns. And most recently, you served as the Boston Police Reform Task Force as a member. Can you speak about why you responded to serve on the task force, and also talk about the recommendations that came out of this and the on-the-ground impact these recommendations have in our communities?
Well, first and foremost, my mother always taught me to say, be thankful when invited to someone's house or program. So, Ms. Joseph, I want to thank you and your colleagues from the Boston Debate League, Suffolk University, for extending this invitation to me. As I mentioned to you when I wrote, I'm humbled by that, particularly with not only my distinguished representative and my distinguished counselor, who I'm personal friends with, and pleased to be on with, but also with Professor Bond-Fortier as well. I'm happy to talk about the why I think it's important. I think that was an excellent question. To put it in context, particularly when we have young people here and all of us want to be in getting involved in public service and or civic engagement, and you have to have a starting point as for that involvement. But before I do, I also want to thank Mayor Walsh and Commissioner Gross for giving me the opportunity to serve on the task force, and certainly served with an extraordinary group of task force members. And I can assure you there were many divergent views, but we've come with we came with recommendations to the mayor with unanimity. And oftentimes that can't happen. I also want to thank Representative Holmes and Councilor Campbell for their work on this particular issue as well. So I think as a triumvirate, we can work on trying to move this agenda forward, and we're not at odds. We just will have different places where we need to approach the issue, and there's a role for everybody. But, when asked to serve on the task force by Mayor Walsh and also by Commissioner Gross, I said yes because I felt I brought a perspective to the table. I'm a New York kid, born in the Bronx, raised in Queens, worked in Brooklyn, partied in Manhattan. When I grew up in the 50s, there was officer friendly. There were two officers in my neighborhood, the Arab brothers. When they came around, they said, I don't want to see you in the corner. When I walked back around the block, we were gone. But they also we had PAL in New York, and we had several different ways in which we interacted with the police. So for us, when I was growing up, there was a sense that and I'm sure that there were situations where this didn't occur, but I had more of a friendly relationship with police. But as well in my various roles as a town administrator in Stoughton, and also as a BHA administrator, I had police who reported to me. So I've had police officers. I have family and friends who are police officers at all levels, and so they were friends. But I also, as a Black male, I've had the driving while Black, walking while Black, running while Black situations where, I still at 70 years old, if I see a police car that passes me, I'm going to look in the rearview mirror to see if they're going to do a U-turn in order to come see me. So that's what we operate in. Told my son, who is now deceased, and my grandson, who is 10 years old, still talk to them about what they need to do in those types of situations. So, in particularly interacting with police. So I came on the committee as well to address the issue of accountability and consequences. I'm old school. There's consequences for your actions. And so therefore, if you use excessive force, you break the rules. No, you don't pass go, you go directly to jail. There are consequences for your actions. And that's when the representative was talking about qualified immunity. I'm filing some lawsuits now. I won't be any more specific than that. And you have to try to overcome that qualified immunity. The additional piece with the qualified immunity is those who have committed bad behavior in one jurisdiction are able to take that bad behavior to other jurisdictions without their poor and bad record following them. So that's why the national conversation is going on to address that. So that's the reason why I joined. I brought a perspective to it. I didn't come in with an attitude of anti-police. I didn't come in with an attitude of defunding police. My principal thing was I want police officers to do what their motto is, which is protect and serve. And if we can get them to protect and serve, then a lot of what we're talking about here would fall to the wayside and we'd have a better relationship. So as we labored with a multiplicity of meetings during the summertime, the persons who I served with were on the task force chaired by Attorney Wayne Budd. We had many different views from my good friend Jamal Crawford, who is a community activist and was head of the new Black Panthers, to Tanisha Sullivan, who is the president of the Boston branch NAACP, to Sergeant Crispin, who heads up MAMLEO, to the chief of staff for the Boston Police Department, and served on that committee. So we had the divergent views, which I think is a good way to have the committee come together, because I think we came up with a great product. So what do we ultimately recommend to the mayor, and which he adopted and has moved ahead on many of those initiatives already, and I'll speak to that as well. So one, we wanted to create an independent office of police accountability and transparency, which we call OPAT. And that body would be able to have investigatory and subpoena power, which was in existence. And what it basically substituted for is what is currently the Civilian Review Board, I forgot the terminology right now offhand, but the Citizen Review Board.
CoOp.
CoOp, sorry. Yeah.
The CoOp, thank you very much. The CoOp, which doesn't have investigatory power and or subpoena power, and could only review a number of the complaints that may have been filed with the police department. And so this body, the OPAT, will have the full ability to get all of the complaints that are filed, have their independent investigation, and to use subpoena power. The representative spoke about the formalizing and the issue of diversity and inclusion, and that too was addressed by us in several forms, and I'll talk more about it as we continue the conversation here. But one of the things that we wanted to do, we wanted to have a situation whereby we can diversify the police department. And so what we proposed, and the mayor just recently filed a executive order, and he has to go for a home rule petition, which going to this, the Boston City Council, was to look at changing the civil service to include students of color who may have graduated from the Boston Public Schools, Metco, charter schools, et cetera, to give them, as we have with civil service, examples of military preference, et cetera, that they would have an opportunity to have in terms of a preference or the numerical score that's used for the determination for the civil service, that would be included, and the mayor adopted that. We were concerned about the expansion of the use of body-worn cameras. We think that that has a deterrent effect or for untoward behavior, because one of the things that we wanted to be able to do was to ensure that there was a recording of that. And so we put in place or recommended expanded use of the body-worn camera with the maintenance of those, the retention of those, who can have access to it. And that has all been adopted by the mayor and by the police commissioner. We talked about the use of force policies to get to that accountability and consequences that I spoke of. So that fine. So the issue of the chokehold and those issues had already been dealt with by the police department, because they adopted the national there's a procedure called the 8. They had adopted that, but we've expanded that. There are additional rules that are put in place by Commissioner Gross with regards to the use of force policy. And then the last piece is the one of accountability, transparency, and public access. So there's going to be there's a dashboard, and we want the dashboard to keep folks informed of what's going on. These investigations that take place of complaints made by citizens, we want to know, we want them to move forward first and foremost to be investigated, and we want people to know what the results are. And then lastly, the adoption of a civilian review board. That was something which had been sought after for quite some time in Boston. It now is in place. That's something too that it would have to go before the council for its Boston City Council for its approval. But this would be a number of citizens who would be looking at not only what the OPAT would be doing, but persons can bring individual complaints to the Civilian Review Board. It would be a body that has both the mayor and city councils selection or appointment of these individuals. So we try to be expansive, take into account all of the things. I will say on a personal note, for me, the impetus for all of this, and I know there were many of the deaths that were mentioned by you, Ms. Joseph, at the outset of this conversation, but the one that I think brought the issue and honed in on the issue for most of us was the watching those 8 minutes and 9 seconds, whatever the time frame of George Floyd. That brought the matter home to us, and I think that was the impetus for a lot of the reactions that have taken place in these discussions for police reform.
Thank you, Attorney Feaster. I'd now like to turn to Professor Bond, because you've done research in the areas of policing, collaboration, and organizational change, policy implementation, and you work directly within a local police department to implement reforms. Can you talk about the successes, failures, lessons to take into account in the struggle to reform policing so that it best serves its constituency, the communities?
Sure, thank you, Jackie, and thanks for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, folks who are really doing the real hard work on the ground and are persevering. So I'm pleased to be part of this conversation, and thanks to the Boston Debate League and of course my home institution, Suffolk University. It's just great to be part of this. And I'm delighted to, I think, bring a research perspective, I think, to this conversation. But let me sort of back up and just offer a sort of a note about how I came to work in this area. As you mentioned, my first sort of real job out of my graduate program was working for a local police department where I really didn't have any understanding of policing. I sort of was interested in criminal justice, but I didn't, at that point in my life, I had no real understanding of the impact of the work of the police, or how important they were. And spending time working in a police agency just opened my eyes tremendously to the critical role that police play in sort of the safety and quality of life for communities. And it was really there that I found a passion for not just working with the police and being supportive, but also living up to certain standards. And I think that after leaving that work in local policing, I really became committed to the idea of both supporting the police, but also raising expectations around how they interact with community and provide service. So in my research over the last actual couple of decades, I've really spent time trying to understand police agencies and their relationships with the community and their interactions with each other and other agencies. And I hope that I think in some ways what I'll have to say sort of just reinforces all of what my previous panelists have talked about in terms of the work that they're doing. But a couple of things I think are important. First of all, there are, in this country alone, there are over 18,000 different police agencies. And when I think about how challenging it is to change the work of police, I think we have to sort of set it in the context of the fact that we have so many different police agencies. And because there are no national standards by which every agency has to work, it makes the idea of change very difficult and the actual act of changing very difficult. And in some ways, there are some pros and cons to the fact that local police agencies in particular are really grounded in their local community and their state laws and what the community should want from the police agency. That just makes the idea of change as an institution very difficult, right? We may try to change what happens in one city versus another, but it may be that the city right next door to us is using old practice, outdated practices, traditional practices that have been proven to not really work. So I think it's important to know that, especially to reiterate this point that there are no national standards. So when we think about what's happening at the state level and at the local level in terms of policy change, I think we have to be thinking about this idea of moving towards standards. Accreditation, there's an organization called CoOp, and police accreditation is a voluntary activity. Police agencies that want to try to achieve accreditation do so voluntarily, and it's extremely difficult and extremely resource intensive to meet those standards. So the kinds of things that I think that are happening at the local level and the state level are really important, about trying to sort of create these state level standards by which all police agencies at the state level do operate. But I would say that from a sort of a research perspective, being grounded in research is really important, and making sure that those policies and those practices that happen at the state level and at the local level are grounded in the evidence, and using the data in terms of what we know in order to inform what happens at the local level and through these policies. What makes change so difficult? And what I've learned and what others have talked about, and some of this won't be surprising, is that first of all, you have traditional institutions that for the most part have been insulated from public scrutiny, have been insulated from any real formal forms of accountability, and have been able to sort of either rectify or resolve problems on their own. And only in the last several decades have we seen this movement towards more transparency and accountability. And I think that's it's a level of resistance from within the institution that makes change so very difficult, right? So you have in organizations, especially organizations like policing institutions, where there's real long-standing tradition, real long-standing culture, real long-standing norms. There are also a significantly powerful collection of interest groups that really would like the institution of policing to stay the way it is, right? And so thinking back to what Representative Holmes talked about in terms of the challenges around the reforms around qualified immunity, a lot of that is because you have different interest groups who are advocating for their own interests, right? But then you have others that are also advocating for change. So I think between some of the challenges that happen within institutions around individuals, but also structural challenges. It's not, there's no one way to change organizations. There's no one way to reform organizations. A lot of times organizations try to enact change that it's really superficial, but it's not institutionalized. And so changing an institution as stubborn as a police institution is very complex. And my research that I've done over the years, and also a lot of the work that I do with police organizations across the country, I'm a subject matter expert for the Department of Justice and work with police agencies all over the country to try to improve what they're doing. It's multi-level. And as we've already talked about, it requires that we are doing multiple things at the same time. And it requires that we think about policy at the local level. Change in police practice and policy does require efforts from the state level policymakers, and in some cases, federal level policymakers. Change requires real, genuine, meaningful, and sustained partnerships. And when I speak about partnerships, a lot of folks know what I might be talking about, but partnerships that are both internal and external. And some of what I have learned is what is required between, for example, in police agencies that have unionized workforce, and some of them have multiple unions. So what's the collaboration within these institutions to think about what are the kinds of things that we need to do to change, and then how do we do that? And sometimes that can take years in order to actually occur. So partnerships within the organization, but also external partnerships. There was a time when police didn't feel like they needed to partner. But what we've learned in the last several decades is that in order for the police to really do their job well, they do have to partner, and they have to partner with different types of institutions. We talked early on about offender reentry. In order for offenders to successfully reintegrate into the community, you need police, mental health, substance abuse provider service programs. You need workforce development, housing authorities. You need a lot of different types of agencies to come together. And so when police are trying to do their job, they have to partner with nonprofit institutions. They have to partner with business institutions, educational institutions, private sector institutions, in order to try to create community safety in their community that makes the most sense for them. Also, other things that need to happen internally. You need changes in workforce, in the workforce, right? So there may be jobs that should be completed, or maybe jobs that should be done by folks who are not sworn police officers, right? So you see that in a lot of big cities, but most of the police agencies in this country are not big cities. Right. So if we're thinking about changing institutions, we want to think beyond just the big cities. And how do you help smaller agencies use their resources and create a workforce that really serves the needs of the community? That includes talking with the community and figuring out what those needs are. Also, the research suggests that you need to look around performance and accountability systems. And not just to implement these systems in superficial ways, but use these systems to both make decisions around deployment, make decisions about how you use your resources. Also take a real hard look at what you're doing as an organization and identify ways to improve. And so there's really, and you need leadership, obviously, and you need political will, which is a lot of what we've already talked about. But changing an institution as traditional and as stubborn as a policing institution does require change at multiple levels inside the organization and outside the organization. It does call for new ways of thinking about what the police are doing. It also, one thing that I feel like is really missing from a lot of these conversations is that we know a lot from other disciplines and other sectors. And Representative Holmes started by talking about things like certification. If you compare the policing industry to the healthcare industry, there's no reason why we shouldn't have similar types of systems around certification and training and education and accountability and oversight. And the police would be at the heart of that, but then you'd have others like educators, mental health professionals. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, most of the training is delivered by folks who are previous or current sworn police officers. Where are trained educators in the police training system, right? And of course, I'm biased because I'm an educator, but what kind of partnerships could happen with educational institutions? And then my last comment, I think, is I really want to see more research brought into decisions and operations in policing and in all aspects of it, in training, in body-worn cameras, in community relationships, in facilitating collaboration between other agencies. There's an enormous amount of research out there that should be embedded in the decisions and the implementation of police and community collaboration. And I think the nature of the industry hasn't necessarily called for it, but I think we should be demanding more. Just like evidence-based practice in healthcare, you wouldn't ask a doctor to diagnose you or treat you unless it was grounded in evidence. We should be expecting the same in our police services. So thanks.
Thank you. Brenda, you spoke to, partnerships, and at the top of this, Representative Holmes talked about working in isolation. How do we realistically, do this work right now, address this? There's so much division right now, and whether it's right or wrong, about defunding the police. Recently, a new documentary is released on Netflix, Trial 4, which hits pretty close to home. Docuseries about a teen that's charged for killing a Boston police officer in 1993. And while he fights to prove his innocence, he exposes police corruption and systemic racism. And all of this demonstrates that there are big structural issues that push back against reform. So how do we begin to address this? And I throw this out to all of the panelists before we dive into our audience questions. I'd love to get your response to that.
Well, Ms. Joseph, I'll take a first crack at it. First, and interesting that you mentioned that series on Netflix. That's Ellis's Jamal Crawford's cousin, and Jamal served on the task force with us. I think that question is the underpinning of all of the efforts that all of us are talking about. And I was glad to hear Professor Bond refer to the research aspect, because we do need the research as it talks about what is going to be happening across the different various police departments and types of police departments throughout this particular country. But there's going to need to be a blending between the activists, the politicians, as we have here with our representative and our counselor. We're going to have to come and the community. And also, there's a question in the chat about the role of police unions in this whole conversation. There's going to have to be some type of synergy that we're going to have to come to a form of reckoning. We have reached a point, as far as I'm concerned, whereby this issue of police violence, particularly towards Black and brown persons, is going to need to be dealt with in a very, very stringent and way. And I think that all of us are now coming together in order to have that type of conversation. And my hope is that as a result of what has transpired, these efforts, be it Black Lives Matter, the various community groups that exist here in Boston, and with the great work and persons in political positions to make things happen, such as our representative and our counselor, that we're able to bring it forward. Because before we were just stymied because the conversation would be had, but we would then be ignored and nothing would go anywhere. Well, I think we're at a point in time when that will change, and I'm hoping that that will be the situation going forward.
I'll just add, I absolutely agree with Attorney Feaster that, we have to work in partnership, and we're not going to agree on everything. I saw something in the chat about compromise. Compromise is critically important in order to get things done. And I've hosted a whole, conversations and meetings around some of the difficult topics with both our unions, our district attorney, Rep. Holmes attend some of these meetings, our police associations, advocacy organizations. Jamal Crawford clearly is one of the activists and folks on the ground. All of us have to be working together on this and in partnership. It's critically important. Two other pieces though that I want to stress though is the power of the people. Those who are being over-policed, killed, murdered, incarcerated at high rates need to also hold their political leaders and those who have the power to transform these systems accountable. I often say many of these executive roles with the stroke of a pen, whether it's the governor who says, you know what, I really think I want to do something immediately around solitary confinement, or the mayor's office that says, I want to do something immediately around, whether it's civilian review board, the public safety dashboard, things that have been talked about for years. And if people do not mobilize, and they have recently, hence we're seeing the movement we're seeing now, this progress or this transformative change that we want to see will take decades. And I'm one of those electeds that say that's unacceptable because it's personal for me. And so it's just a reminder I know there are a lot of young people on here who are actively involved. They're emailing us to understand or actively involved and looking for ways to get civically involved. Hold your folks accountable that you elect to put here. That you elect. The last piece is communities of color and those who have been oppressed and marginalized for really long periods of time, they often understand the other perspective. We understand why we need police. I often say, with the defunding movement, I am for reallocating a percentage of our $70 million police overtime budget to programs and initiatives that serve and that get at the root causes of violence. But for me, the defunding movement does not mean abolish the police. And so there are many who are showing up in this movement who understand the value in the role that police play, who value individual officers and the sacrifices they make, including those who are unionized. But I think where sometimes it is a struggle is getting folks on the opposite side of the table to understand how race and racism play a role in policing, that communities of color are over-policed, that parents of Black and brown children have to teach their children how to interact differently when it comes to police. The defunding movement, I didn't choose the language, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say, what are they talking about? What are they getting at? What's the undercurrent here that they're trying to get us to understand? And there is often a reluctance or a defensiveness when it comes to that. And I think it's incumbent upon many of us to push those who differ in opinion to be more thoughtful and listen more to what the opposite side is saying in order to continue a productive conversation and to get things done. And so I have to apologize, Jacqueline, you know this, I have a hard stop at 6, you know this, and I just apologize if I have to cut out early before we sort of get to all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Did you want to take some questions before the counselor leaves? I can give my comments after that.
Sure. Well, I'll read a question here from a student from Boston Line Academy. How would you work with Mayor Walsh to get concrete change in the justice and police system? Obviously, personal opinions differ, but some way compromises need to be made. And this is particularly for Councilor Campbell. Mayor Walsh only took out $15 million from a $414 million budget. How do you feel about this, and do you want to see more?
Well, I'll say, the mayor and I, we're from the city. We love Boston and we care about this city. We care about these issues deeply. We just have a different way of thinking about them and a different perspective. I will say on the reallocation piece, I would have cut more resources. So I actually voted against the last budget for that very reason, that I thought that we could have been taking more out of the $70+ million overtime police budget and redirecting it to mental health services, to trauma supports, and to other programs that are proven, connecting to Professor Bond's point, right, that are proven to solve and reduce incidents of violence, including moving people out of poverty. And so I will continue to work with the administration on greater transparency and accountability. One of my incredible residents is in this chat, Ms. Carol Benjamin, who had an unfortunate incident at a grocery store. We have been pushing and pushing for accountability for her. And all she wanted was an apology from an officer. And she's still waiting for that. And so this shows me, along with so many other incidents, that we have a lot more work to do in terms of accountability. But also I understand the purpose of compromise and will continue to do that with the task force members who've put forth really incredible and thoughtful provisions for us to adopt. And then of course, pushed us to say we need to also do more as a city as well.
Ms. Joseph, if I can just follow up and echo what the counselor has said, because as I mentioned earlier on, at the task force, we came to unanimity on a number of issues. And one of them was exactly, we talked about the reallocation of resources, and we wanted to see our recommendations implemented to the extent that they could without an expansion of the budget for the police department. So we stand in tandem with the counselor in that regard, that the reallocation of the resources, and as while we were in our deliberations, there was a discussion about the overtime budget. Now, that wasn't anything that we did not look at the police budget at the task force and make any determinations, but we certainly feel and support the idea of looking at their resources, determining it. Now, I'm a mental health advocate. And so for me, the counselor mentioned this in her conversation, the deployment of the police sitting in that space trying to deal with persons who are afflicted with mental health in those circumstances. In most instances, those have turned out very, very poorly. My own personal situation, I was fortunate with my own son in that, he is now deceased, but it wasn't as a result of being adversely impacted when it was a police interaction, and there was police interactions during that time. So what we need to do is, with the reallocation of resources, is deploying them in different ways, which will better service the community. And counselor, I'd say to the person in chat who is your constituent, this is exactly what we're talking about with the OPAT. This is exactly what we're talking about with the Civilian Review Board. And I would simply say that I don't need to suggest to you or to her where they ought to take that, but there is a procedure, and I think there should be surprised if there's not greater sensitivity to addressing that particular concern. So I would just say, make that call to where that needs to be. But I think that within the police department, there would be sensitivity to investigate that situation at that shopping center.
So I know the counselor has to leave, but
Yes.
didn't know if you want to give any other questions for the counselor, but sounds like she's leaving now.
Yes, it's 6 p.m. Thank you so much, Councilor, for joining us. And thank you, Rep.
Thank
Holmes,
you,
for
and look forward to continuing the conversation. You know how to find
Absolutely.
me. Thank you to my fellow panelists. And thank you, Rep. Holmes.
All right. So I'm going to begin with where I think the problem is. The problem for me, and some of the questions inside of the chat, was around unions. That is our problem. I can tell you right now, people say, oh, why don't I run for mayor and all the other stuff. If I ever ran for mayor, I would begin with one slogan: nobody makes more than me. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that the mayor is the 775th paid employee in the city of Boston. That is because of fire and police and all these guys doing all this overtime money and working their details and the like. I can tell you none of them, from my perspective, work harder than the mayor. The mayor's the hardest job there is in the city. And the fact that we've taken a role roles, that's fire, police, EMS, and others, taking these roles that for 100 years, veterans were coming back, and there was this whole thought about we have to take care of our veterans, and we still believe this, but we need to take care of our disabled veterans in particular. And they get this highest priority. Like, you go and you get at the top of the list because you're disabled. And it still astonishes me that a disabled veteran is the whole list of the top 40 people about to be hired on the most rigorous job there possibly can be, and as a fireman. How on earth do I expect you to go and jump out of windows, go jump through windows, carry hoses up and down ladders, yet you are disabled? It is because they've gamed the system. They have said, okay, we have this provision for disabled veteran. And one of the things I keep hearing many of them say, well, we've lost some of our hearing. And so when we lose our hearing coming back from war, they go over, get the disabled veteran status, and now they go and propel to the top of the list. And I think this is just absolutely ridiculous that it creates these avenues where you have to be a veteran, you have to be disabled, and literally you have a class of 40 firemen and 38 of them are disabled veterans. That's not what we were envisioning. So when it was envisioned 100 years ago, where you would take care of a disabled veteran and put them at the top of the list, I'm sure they were probably thinking, oh, well, if someone's disabled, physically disabled, typically, we're going to make sure they find a role in government to make sure that we can still take care of our veterans, not to have them be the highest paid people in all of government, literally, all of these fire and police. And so the reason this happens is because the mayor and governor and everyone else in these collective bargaining agreements, they walk into the room saying that they are negotiating with heroes. And so when you go into a room and every person on the other side of this conversation is a hero, and so these heroes are also humans, I just like to remind people that it is the case. And if you put all of the folks you're negotiating with and the status of heroes, then you come up with these contracts that are just incredible. You go in, you work in, you do a detail for 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, and you get paid for 4. I mean, just the provisions that are being put in for these heroes, I think it's the problem. So when I heard Attorney Feaster talk about body cameras, yeah, look what it took for us to get the body cameras. They negotiate everything. You can't put a body camera onto a cop unless they've negotiated through their unions all the things and the provisions and the money and everything else they're going to get before they put a body camera on. Not thinking what is best for the community, what is best for society. No, that's not what they're thinking. How do I get more money? How do I get to be making $340,000 a year? That's what the problem is. And so that's one. Two, so many things that Professor Bond said today are just so much in alignment with what we were talking about. And it comes to, we never had a conversation. Attorney Feaster and I never had a conversation. Councilor and I obviously talk a lot, but you can see there's synergy. We are all talking the same language because it's all just facts. These are just facts. You're disproportionately impacting and doing FIOs in Black and brown community. That's just disproportionate. You should know that's to be the case. And then when she talked about just a lack of standards, you can have it so that a police officer in the western part of the state, some part-time cop, goes out and gets 250, 300 hours worth of training, and then they get a badge and a gun. Or you can have the state police who are getting 1,200 hours of training before they can go get a badge and a gun. And then all of a sudden, these are the same people. What do I mean by that? I'm a Black dude. I roll up anywhere. All I normally see is some lights in my back, and I see a white dude typically. He has a badge and a gun. I don't know that this white dude here, he barely has any training. But this white dude over here, he has thousands, 1,200 hours worth of training. They come at me the same way. And so here it is, this guy over here doesn't even have the training on his firearm. And these guys over here have something very different. So these are the things that we are trying to figure out. And Eddie can say I did some misinformation. I don't know what he's just talking about, but what I talk about are facts, just that simple. And Eddie can say what he wants. It'd be great for him to get on the mic so we can have this debate as we continue to have this debate. That is the question. These unions negotiate everything, and they negotiate from a status of heroes. That's what the problem is. That's where it begins.
Thank you, Representative
I'm
Holmes.
going to try to read the questions. I saw one pop up for me and try my best to respond as well, but I'm sure someone else may want to respond.
Well, we do have some more questions that I can read out here from a student from the BDL. Their question is that there are programs, and there are current programs, many movements, programs that are working towards change, but what programs are working to release individuals who are currently unjustly incarcerated?
So what's interesting is you asked that question. One of the 4 provisions in the criminal justice piece or the police reform that I had mentioned before was about an idea that came from the incarcerated folks at MCI Norfolk around structural racism. And what they have said often is that they didn't end up doing this crime just out of the blue. There were just systemic issues all along the way. As mentioned by the professor, you're going to have the same crime 8 times more likely if a Black person is going to have this crime and be incarcerated than a white person, 4 times more likely same crime on many crimes for Hispanic than white. And so one of the things has been, how do we go back and try to solve just the injustices that have been happening for decades? And I asked Rachel about this, because the Black and the elected of color, we get together every 2 weeks here in Boston. And one of the things that you have not seen recently, Rachel has been going through this whole integrity team of being able to go back, and she could go back and see 40, 50 years ago when literally people in her job would make sure that they had a defendant that was Black, they would have a jury that was all white. They would make sure they would cut out just essentially a jury of her peers. And she's been going through and just asking folks that if you have these cases where people feel as though they've been incarcerated, or they still, not just the Innocent Project, but if your cases that are important for her to see, on her website, you can go, I forget exactly what the pull down is, but I can look it up in just a moment, where those attorneys, those families can come in, put that question into her team. She has a dedicated person who's trying to address those. You can see here recently, Anna King has been locked up since 1972. She recently went through the process of getting his case reduced. Because one of the challenges around these cases is joint venture. I'll say to you, and I'll end, Jackney, and then let someone take another question. We see cases where someone goes, they do something wrong. One person's driving the car, one person's shooting the person, and they all get treated equally through joint venture. And what would happen is, very often, you will see the person who may have been driving and not done the shooting go and fight their case all the way to the end. But they're like, I'm not the shooter, and the shooter might get pled down. Like, the shooter might say, hey, he's been witnessed, and so yeah, he did the murder, he's out in 15 years. Yet the person who was driving the car is still locked up 25 years later, because they went through the entire case and they got sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And so these are the types of cases, like in Mr. Anna King's case, where I think he was initially deemed murder 1, it was reduced down to murder 2. He got a 25-year sentence, and since he had basically done 50 years, he was able to then be released. So those types of things are happening, but it is going to be pretty much case by case. The governor's not about to do a carte blanche like what happened in New Jersey over this weekend or last weekend and release 2,000 people. We are the least incarcerated state in the country, and there's been lots of reforms already put in place to try to continue to make that happen.
Ms. Joseph, can I take the liberty? I find a question in the chat that I found particularly intriguing. I'd like to respond if that would be appropriate.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is from Jennifer Bartholomew, because I think it gets to the heart of what we're talking about. And let me just summarize what she asked. She's an MPA graduate student here at Suffolk University. Says, what level of collaborative engagement is occurring to ensure that voices and experiences of disenfranchised communities are heard and utilized in the work being done, and not just from a reactive standpoint, but from a proactive standpoint as well? I would say, Ms. Bartholomew, that that's the essence of what the task force was putting forward and recommended in terms of demand, not only with the compilation of persons who served on the task force, as I mentioned to you, many of us, yes, we have similarities and we share some of the likeness in the sense of things that we believe in, but there are different approaches that some of us on the task force may do, and that's fine. what happens here is the creations of some of the institutionalizers of something such as the OPAT that we talked about, Office of Police Accountability with an executive director, the creation of a civilian review board, the discussions that are going on at the city council level, spurred on by the city councilors, and as far as the administration, the conversations that Representative Holmes and his folks are having. There is the engagement. There is the Black Lives Matter movement that's being discussed. So there is a sense of a grassroots effort. And as I pointed out earlier, I feel triggered by what folks saw with regards to George Floyd. Now, there was another person on here which talked about, well, I think Miss Benjamin, who said, well, why hasn't the mayor or anybody reached out to me because of my circumstances and I'm retired and I know this issue? I certainly can't answer that, but I can certainly say that as far as persons who may be adversely dealt with by police, or those who feel disenfranchised because it's not a vehicle for raising their complaints, that's what we're trying to address. And as Councilor Campbell said, the people, the citizenry, got to make sure that these things that we've sought to implement are done, carried out, support the work of what the mayor is doing, the council is doing, and Representative Holmes and his colleagues, because they can raise them, but if they don't see the groundswell of support coming in from the citizens, then we're doomed in terms of getting them implemented. And then lastly, the piece about the police unions, just as we did, that the predominant, if you will, contention adverse to what the task force work was done was by the Boston Police Union. And my sense of it is the mayor and will have to deal with that in the negotiations. But the reality is, as Representative Holmes said, and Councilor Campbell, the other side is blind to try to implement change. And that's the part which is distressing in all of this, because you can't look at a George Floyd circumstance and not feel that something needs to be done and there needs to be change and there needs to be consequences. And for a body of folks such as the police union to hold to the fact that that means nothing, that nothing should be done, is really a tragic commentary.
Well, Joe, let me just say, in all of our meetings, all of the meetings, so the Black and Latino Caucus was meeting with the unions, talking to Eddie, we're talking to all of the leaders of the unions, whether it be state and city, and they were in agreement that change is needed. They were in agreement. But when you go make change, you actually had the head of the union. There was a group of folks who made a move to go and remove him because he was actually saying, I'm going to try to work with people. This is, again, you know, what I hear constantly is they say, well, we negotiated that right. And so when I see the question in the text about what do I think is next, and I'm surprised, the word was surprise. I'm sorry that I relayed to you a sense of surprise that I saw this resistance. I'm sorry, I was never surprised. I knew that the union was going to be as powerful as they are. You're talking about, again, I said, look at how well funded they are by the membership. So rest assured, we know they have plenty of funding, and to come at this with some of the most trained and most astute people from around the country. They started raising money to come in against this bill because they do not want it to happen in Massachusetts. So I'm sorry that I relayed or somehow said that I was surprised at that. I'm not surprised. I just believe that we've come down to the fact that there are two things that they say. Well, the one thing that did surprise me actually about the unions is they've now been putting full page ads up in newspapers saying, let's do what the Black and Latino Caucus asked to do. And so those conversations have actually been very beneficial because they've said, now we agree with the 4 components that we mentioned. They agree that they should enact all of these things around use of force. They agree with that. But however, we have let qualified immunity run the conversation. And so people have asked me, well, where am I on qualified immunity? I'm at qualified immunity is not worth the 4 things that we've demanded from the beginning. So the elected color across this Commonwealth came and said the 4 things that I've mentioned. That's from Ayanna's the only federal elected of color across the Commonwealth, all the way down to our city councilors, Councilor Campbell, myself, and the State House. And we feel as though those things are important. And so I think the unions could find a place, where the caucus could find a place where we could land on qualified immunity. I think we could have gotten it done on July 31st. And here it is almost December, and we still might end up without a bill. So when the question came in about what's holding us up there, six people who are in a joint committee right now, who they just did what they said they were going to do from the beginning, listen to Black people. I'm sick and tired of folks trying to say to us that they know better for our community than us. As I said to you guys from the beginning, I represent the Blackest district in this Commonwealth. I hear from Black people, and these are the things that they're saying. Stop choking us, stop killing us, stop coming and doing all of these things that are inappropriate. If you don't do those things, you never even get the qualified immunity. Joe, you don't even get there because there's no civil rights suit because you never did the act. Let us take what we've had as a win, take what we've worked with the unions and everyone else, and let's sign this bill. And then let's move on to the next question around the other pieces that need to come afterwards.
And Representative, just to echo what you have said, and I stated this before, what we're simply asking them to do, what they do in all other communities, to protect and serve. And that's all that's being sought. And if we get to protect and serve, you're absolutely correct that those things that you have put forward as far as on the state level would even be unnecessary, simply because they treat your community like they treat every other community.
And all I'm saying is that we have been listening. We've listened to the police. Like this bill started, there was about what to do about civil service. It started with, to me, one of the most competent people I've met in my life. Her name is Lisa Butner. She's gonna now run the cadet program at the state police. She's the highest ranking Black woman on the state police. She basically came in, we've had a great relationship for 4 or 5 years, and she basically wrote the bill. And all I did was just basically give it over to House Counsel to say, does this make sense? Why would that be the case? She's informed. She knows what's happening behind the scenes and behind the walls. That's why you go talk to the Eddies and the Donald Caseys and all of them, because these are Black people who are in these groups of folks who can see that they're being disproportionately impacted and discrimination is happening even on the other side of the wall. So we're going to ask them, asking them, what are the changes we need to make? And we've done that, and I just think we need to go on and pass the bill.
Jackie,
I'd like
can I
Sure.
just jump in just to make a couple of comments? Only in thinking back to the question that Jennifer Bartholomew asked, 2 points. One, Jennifer is our student and we love her, and Lisa Butner was also our student. We love her too. But a couple of things, just to go back to this idea about how do we do this and the collaboration piece. First is, I think for so long, government and the structures of government have been set up to put the citizens at the furthest part away from policy and practice. And the policy and administrative structures have been at the center of how public service is delivered, and citizens have been the furthest away. And I think what's really exciting about this is, and what we've been talking about, is bringing citizens really back to the center of policy and practice. And what we need is leadership to prioritize citizens at the center of identifying what the needs are, identifying what their concerns are, prioritizing those needs, and making sure that we build service around the center, which I think are citizens and communities. But along with that, and something I see is missing and challenging, is that prioritizing these kinds of conversations and making sure that these conversations happen has been a challenge and a struggle. And in the world of policing, for all kinds of reasons, prioritizing these collaborative and difficult conversations has come at been limited, because the way that police organizations are structured and what they do means that the priorities are responding to 911 calls. And it's not in allowing the police, giving them the training and the skills and the capabilities to engage with and have sustained and difficult conversations with people over a long period of time. Showing up at a community meeting on a Thursday night for a half an hour is not enough. It's just not enough. And so I think getting citizens back at the center and then building those structures and those policies and practices in a way that allow that to happen and allow the police and the community to get together in sustained ways is needed. And that doesn't exist right now. Sorry.
Ms. Joseph, can I ask, I guess it must be the lawyer in me. I wanted to ask uh, Dr. Bond-Fortier the question on that. So talking about the collaboration pieces, I just want to throw out a few things around community policing because that was mentioned in the conversation as well. So we talked about does community policing as a concept begin to get there? If we start looking at deploying, and you mentioned this, maybe civilians doing things that police are deployed to do now. And lastly, what about the residency requirements? How does all of those, how do you think about it, since you're a subject matter expert and you're thinking around and around the country? How do you think that those things play into the help the conversation and the relationships?
So I should say I'm not a subject matter expert in every single police policy or practice, right? Because each one is challenging in and of itself, but a couple things. Research shows that community policing as a concept does not reduce crime, but what it does do is reduce fear, and it helps to build relationships between police and community, right? So I think that, and community policing is a pretty vague concept. And so I think part of what we need, what agencies have done, and Boston's done it pretty well, is figure out, maybe not completely, but what does community policing mean in my community or even in different neighborhoods, right? What does that actually mean? But then you have to give people the time to do it. And if that requires a sort of a real assessment of what is it that people are spending their time on, right? Do you need sworn officers who are supposed to be out in the community doing administrative jobs? Maybe sworn officers won't like me saying that, but I worked as a civilian in a police department before, and a sworn officer shouldn't necessarily be in handling budgets or doing all kinds of things. We should be hiring and staffing police agencies with experts who have the skills and competencies to do this particular type of business that exists in a police agency, right? And same with training and things like that. So I think that community policing and giving people the time to do relationship building and have relationships. You talked about your own personal experience growing up and knowing police officers, having those relationships, right? You can't, I mean, what does it take for those relationships? Sustained engagement, difficult conversations, facilitating those conversations over a length of time is what is really needed. I forget the second question that you asked.
The other one I talked about was, the residency, I said, does that get us to the question or not with regards to requiring the residency for police officers to live in the communities in which they police?
I have no deep knowledge of the research on residency. I personally do not think that it gets at what people think it will get at. I think it offers people an opportunity for a job. I think you need a system in which to support people. But from what I understand, residency is not accessible for a lot of people. It's expensive to live in certain areas. And so I think it's a much more complicated question, but I don't know the research on it. So I can't answer that question. Yeah.
Can I add something about residency?
Yeah,
and so
please do.
Attorney Peace, we're trying to get to this residency because exactly what I was saying before. When you have Nick Collins and I both now struggling to get people on all the police departments, and he's South Boston, so they used to get people on police departments all the time. I'm still having the same struggle that I've had from before. This veterans preference allows folks who can come from anywhere. I can come from Wyoming tomorrow and take this test and have a veterans preference over the guy who grew up at Morton and Blue. You know what I mean? So you from Wyoming show up here, you're going to have a preference and get more points and get more of an opportunity for this job. And you need a GPS. You need to do Google Maps to get to the street. That's ridiculous to me. And so that's, from our perspective, yes, it is more expensive to live in Boston. It does have those challenges the professor mentioned. But I want the person who grew up in my city to have more of an opportunity for a job than somebody who just says, hey, I'm a veteran and I've shown up and I want to go back to Boston. Second, I want to just talk about this, what Professor talks about different roles. One of the things that the Sheriff Tompkins has been advocating for years has been, when you get the police, to arrest someone, should that police need to be sitting with this person they've arrested for hours as they go through this process? He thinks there's, and I agree strongly, that there should be just a lockup that he can do over at the jail. So literally the things that he's accustomed to doing all day, which is house people and get them through the process of pre-trial and trial and all the other stuff, we could then get these cops off this whole paperwork trail, have them arrest someone, don't even take them to the district, don't even take them to B2, B3 or wherever, just take them straight on over to the regional lockup, have them processed, and then back on the street where they can actually do exactly what you're talking about with community policing. The problem with community policing is the Black community feel like it's the opposite. We feel like our communities are being policed, not that we're having community policing. And so stop policing our communities, because those are not the same thing. We want real community policing, real meetings with people, like you said, not a half an hour or an hour every month to come talk to us and tell us the latest police report. But we actually would love to have a beat cop still just walk on the beat and knowing the people who are just in the area.
Can I want to clarify on the residency piece, because there's two components of that. As I noted with what the task force came out, Representative and also Professor Bond-Fortier, we agree with the thing that's what we talked about, persons who attended Boston Public School, METCO, and all of those in terms of being to get the job. What I was talking about, as I believe the requirement is now, and yes, you've had the situation, Representative, when one comes in, they say you live in the city, they come in for about a year and they advance. We're not talking about that. I think beyond that is a situation where I think it's something like if you have to live in the city for 3 years, after you are appointed, you have to live in 3 years and go. And what I was asking Professor Bond-Fortier is, did they find that the fact that one has to live in the city, does that enhance the ability for the relationship? So there were the two parts.
Yeah, it's 1 year, but what I was saying, Attorney Fisa, is that I don't want to add something on to cops. Teachers do the same thing, right? So teachers run out of my city too. I would love it that if the teachers stayed in the city too. So I was just trying to, I hear you were trying to get the data, but I was trying to say, I'm more concerned with this 1 year. You're in the city for a year and you get rights to a job that the folks who grew up here the whole time. That's all of that.
We agree on that, and that we agree on. I just wanted to point out the two ways in which I was looking at my question to the professor was whether the residency piece added anything to the community policing piece.
And I can tell you these unions are powerful. When I'm telling you about what the professor's talking about these jobs, it's not just, hey, the regional lockup. What about the flagger question? Literally, I drive into the office today and I see 2 state cops sitting here, stopping, getting a detail to sit here and, while for some construction. Another union issue, right? You sit here, you got to now have a sworn officer, state police and city police doing all of these details on just construction jobs. Well, all you should be trying to do is just direct some traffic, but they say, oh no, something might go down. We always have union folks, police sworn officers, something goes down, they happen to be doing the details somewhere and they go catch someone, things like that. And that's why they think that they've advocated. But again, that's a very expensive detail. And I don't think that you need the sworn officer to do that as well.
I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for the conversation. I've seen comments that it's just very engaging and people are appreciating the information that you've dropped here tonight and the conversation. Thank you so much for participating. If you've enjoyed this conversation, this is just the first in our race equity policy series. The topic of our next community forum will be prosecution, examining the impact of criminal justice policies on Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the court system, and that will take place on Wednesday, December 2nd at 5 p.m. And if you registered for this event, you will likely receive a link invitation to that. But thank you so much to Representative Russell Holmes, to Attorney Joseph Feaster, Professor Brenda Bond-Fortier, and City Councilor Andrea Campbell. I appreciate your time. And I really appreciated this conversation, and it looks like people would love for this to continue. So that's a sign of a great, a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackney. Thank you, everybody.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful
Have a great
evening.
night.
All right.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank you.